Thank you, Dr. Moore, and thank you for being with us this afternoon, which will be surely a special event in Baylor's life. We decided to do something interesting because Dr. Hauerwas contests the notion that he's the best theologian in America because he doesn't think best is a theological category. If he's not the best, he is certainly one of the most interesting. And I realize when you call a theologian very interesting, that's not a very high bar, since most theologians are dead boring. So what we thought we'd do is celebrate the part of Dr. Hauerwas that helped into the 20th century, that genre of theology called not boring theology. So we thought we'd do something interesting, and that is have a conversation with him. You can certainly read his essays, his many books, his sermons in different places, but we thought we'd want to have a conversation between Baylor University and Stanley Hauerwas. And so what we've done is solicited a number of questions from different people in the university, and we've collected those questions, and we're going to converse with Dr. Hauerwas over those questions for the next hour or so. I have several questions before me. At different places, I'm going to ask the audience to continue the conversation by further asking questions or further commenting. We don't have a lot of time this afternoon. Dr. Hauerwas has to rush off to the airport right at about an hour from now, so we don't have a lot of time. I do apologize for that because I know a lot of you want to greet him, a lot of you are his friends and this kind of thing, but we're going to need to scoot him out of here, and we apologize ahead of time. So first, Dr. Hauerwas, thank you for being with us today.
Lovely to be here. Before we start, Jonathan, I just can't help but remark, thank you, Scott, for that introduction, and it could not have happened at Duke. That language of loving Christ, I mean, that could not happen at Duke. No one would be introduced with that kind of first-order religious description, which I hope is true, because it would be offensive. And so you just need to get a sense how extraordinary that is. I was once giving a lecture at Asbury Theological Seminary, and Larry Wood was being installed in a chair there. And before the lecture, he had to take a vow that he was going on to perfection. And I just finished Alistair's Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, in which he argued that you could see the loss of argument in the Scottish University as soon as they stopped the professors from taking vows of Calvinist rectitude. So vows were crucial for the development of argument. And I got to say to the people at Asbury, not exactly my favorite place, I need to tell you, that they had the possibility of rational disagreement in ways we didn't at Duke. Hopefully you have the ways of rational disagreement in ways we don't have at Duke. Thank you so much for that, Scott.
The questions we have before us are far-ranging, from Dr. Hauerwas's memoirs, which we'll begin by talking about, to questions of truth, statements he said in terms of war and pacifism, all the way to what he thinks about having a BCS playoff system. So let me just admonish you and remind you that there will be a lot of things that Dr. Hauerwas will say that you'll look around wondering whether it's okay to laugh. It's okay to laugh in this room today. So let me start. And we're going to start by talking about the memoirs, which Jeff Stout of Princeton University said may be the best Hauerwas book written. So, and that's quite a statement. Philosophy and Honors College professor Doug Henry asks, in Hannah's Child, you deliberately put the effort to tell the story of your life within the genre of memoir. Why do you write in the genre of memoir rather than confession? How would you describe the difference between the two genres? Isn't the genre of confession uniquely fitted for Christians? Indeed, is it possible for Christians to approach telling the truth about themselves, others, and God in a mode other than confession?
Doug, are you here?
I am.
Oh, it's good. Thank you. The short answer is I'm not a good enough Christian to write in a confessional mode. Because the confessional mode, at least as Augustine exemplifies it, is one long prayer that I cannot sustain. So I don't know how to display my life in dependency on God the way that Augustine did, because I don't have Augustine's depth. The memoir, I took the form of the memoir and I tried to subvert the over self-revelatory character of the modern memoir that invites voyeurism by trying, because if you believe, as I do, in Wittgenstein's private language argument, how in the hell are you going to take your subjectivity seriously? So what I tried to do was to display my life through friends, and therefore it very much, I hope, is a testimony to friends in a way that defies in some ways the genre of memoir. The truth of the matter is friends had asked me to do this, and I had resisted it because it's such an exercise in narcissism. But of course it turned out I'm just narcissistic enough to do it. So that's what has to be confessed as the sin that shaped the memoir.
Christian Century just released its best books from 2010 and listed Hannah's Child as one of those books. In the story, in the memoirs, Dr. Hauerwas talks substantially about his marriage to his wife, Anne, who had serious mental illness. And so this next question follows on that. Stanley Hauerwas, who Dr. Hauerwas is a big fan of, in his memoir suggests that Austin helped him see that in writing we should take ourselves by surprise. Similarly, Michael Foucault said that he never knew when he started a book how it would end, claiming that if we knew how our books would end, we wouldn't have the courage to write them. In writing your memoirs, Dr. Hauerwas, how were you taken by your surprise? How did you take yourself by surprise? As well, what did you end up writing that required for you courage?
Well, the book ends with a sentence, I'm a Christian. How interesting. That's a big surprise for me. I'm just naturally not a Christian. And I hope that the book solicits my absolute wonderment that somehow that's how I ended up. And it makes me very joyous. And joy, I take, is an expression of surprise. I'd hope I never get used to that surprise. What I think part of the surprise of the book is how you're forced to say things that you should say because of the way you've learned to think, but you didn't know you were forced to say it until you did. And so part of the book is, I think of the book as a literary book. It's theological, but it's a literary book because it's a writer's book. And I'm a kid from Pleasant Grove, Texas, who learned how to write. And I think that that is a great gift that universities have to be about, teaching us how to write.
Speaking of Pleasant Grove, one undergraduate here asks, Dr. Hauerwas, did you ever go cruising down Buckner and hang out at Griff's in Pleasant Grove?
It was the A&W that I hung out at. Griff's was for the tough guys.
Another student asks, do you eat steak? You are, after all, a Texan. What do you think about eating meat?
I think that eschatologically we are obligated to be vegetarians, but I'm a Texan.
Someone asked this question. I'm not sure who would have the irreverence to ask this question, but dear Dr. Hauerwas, where do you get all those strange neckties? And do you purposely wear them as some kind of peculiar personal statement, somewhat like the satisfaction you seemingly take in your peppery language or strong Texan accent? In other words, have you purposely kept up your Texan accent for a purpose in academia? What are these things about?
Well, any of you that have been part of academia outside Waco knows that if you talk like this, it's a big disability. You're supposed to learn how to talk in slow and measured speech to show that you are extraordinarily thoughtful. I wouldn't mind doing that, I just never knew how, and I didn't have time to learn it. The neckties are TJ Maxx. And I never pay more than $5.50.
Some would say that's quite apparent. I was the irreverent one that asked the question. So.
Right. And I didn't used to wear neckties, and then when men started wearing interesting neckties, I thought, well, that's good. So I tried it, and I liked it for a long time. But I'm also a great fan of Ireland, and these are called grandfather shirts in Ireland, and I like them a lot. So.
Open it up to the audience. Questions you guys have about memoirs, biography, these kinds of things. Tim.
I wonder how you personally handle, putting out something like a memoir and going to places and speaking about your life, and just handling, fame and all that goes with it, and as a Christian, and how that works in your life.
Fame is a killer, and I try to defeat it in every way I can. The most important thing, at least one of the things I'd like the memoir to have done is to remind people I'm a human being. And that means whatever that public reality out there called Stanley Hauerwas is, it ain't me. And I mean, it's a little like, think about the exchange that's occurring right now. If I took this seriously, it would make me sick. By seriously, I mean, if I thought this number of people were really depended on anything that I said because, quote, I'm an important person. That'll kill you. What I hope happens, I say things that help you discover important aspects of your life that you hadn't quite become articulate about. So I know it sounds odd to say that you've written a memoir to avoid fame, but that's part of what I'm trying to do. And it's a way to suggest how your life has been made more than it could have been because of the people that claimed you. So that, when I get a lot of letters about this book, and part of it is people that when you've lived with someone that's mentally ill, it creates an extraordinary loneliness. And I wanted the book to at least articulate for some that other people understand the loneliness. So I get letters like that. But I also get letters from people that just use the word, "It was a beautiful book." And that means a great deal to me, because I want the book to have people read it. And when I say, "I'm glad I'm a Christian," I hope they are able, from having read the book, to say, "I'm glad I'm a Christian." And that's what the book is meant to be about in that way. I want to be clear, all of that could sound like a gesture toward humility, and I don't trust humility at all. You should never, anyone that tries to be humble, of course, is a fake. I once said to Enna McDonough, a good friend of mine who's a moral theologian in Ireland, about the Irish clergy pedophilia controversy, I said, "Enda, do you think there's any chance that this might teach the church humility in Ireland?" He said, "Possibly. No humility without humiliation." So if you want to know, that's the way I think about Time magazine, by the way. The secular always finds a way to humiliate you. Now, I don't want to suggest that I'm trying to play the humility game or the modesty game. I just am trying to say truthfully what has made my life possible.
One more question around memoirs or biography. I want to invite the folks who are standing in the back. There are plenty of seats in the front, so please come on down and grab a seat. We're going to move on to the topic of race in America. This person asks, "Some believe that President Obama, as a multiracial commander-in-chief, signals a major shift in racial inequality in politics, while others view this as an elusive symbol of change that masks continuing and perhaps worsening inequalities, particularly between whites and African Americans. How do you understand the current racial climate of the United States, and what might promote better race relations?"
Well, I think the election of President Obama and the celebration of Martin Luther King are not, I don't think they represent any kind of overwhelming of what it means for America to be a country shaped by race. I say what we're currently suffering from is the failure of the success of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is now a national holiday. Whites think civil rights were enacted and therefore African Americans won. So African Americans can move to the suburbs, have 2 cars, 3 TVs, and worry about Jews moving in. And then we get to say, what was a little slavery between friends? I think that what it means for America to acknowledge that slavery and the subsequent history was so wrong, there is nothing you can do to make it right, is absolutely crucial for America to learn how to live in a world we do not control, recognizing that the deep pathos of life means that finally you're not going to be able to create the world after your image. And I think that has everything to do with the confession of sin by America in the horror of slavery and genocide against the Native Americans in a manner that makes that part of the story part of high school textbooks in a way that says we didn't know how to deal with it. And that's a deep sadness that this country desperately needs. I don't know how it will happen that this America will resist the story of African Americans as long as that story is the story of suffering. And it's rightly the story of suffering. And until we come to terms with that, I don't think what it means to be a country determined by race will change.
This next question is a similar question, but located in the church. Sunday is regarded as the most segregated day of the week in the southeastern and southwestern United States. While pastors and theologians have made huge strides in overcoming the inherent systemic oppression within Southern culture, multi-ethnic congregations still do not appear to be the norm of life in the Southern U.S. What do you observe to be the preeminent hurdles to Christian churches moving towards a comfort level and expectation of multi-ethnic congregations, especially in the South?
Well, I think that that's a congratulatory characterization of the North. I mean, if you want to see racism on a stick, try Boston and separate congregations. I mean, just go to a Red Sox game, for God's sakes. I don't think we will know how to worship together until we're both under the necessity of needing one another for survival. The church is too safe to be integrated. And that doesn't mean we don't try to do the best we can when we can. But I think that if I were an African American, I would never trust the welcoming of a white church. I mean, that doesn't mean that I think African Americans that go to white churches are somehow making a mistake. But I just mean that a kind of general, y'all come, I think it's going to have to go the other way. It's like people forget in Durham, we have Duke, and in Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, and in Raleigh, North Carolina State, but North Carolina Central's in Durham. It's a huge African American university with a predominantly African American student body. North Carolina, University of North Carolina, is I think less than 10% African American. North Carolina, 17% African American. If you took the student body of North Carolina Central and sent them to University of North Carolina or North Carolina State or Duke, then the question would be, who would remember all those sacrifices and struggles that sustained North Carolina Central? So the issue is so much an issue of memory, particularly when you have a dominant culture who says, we want to remember you better than you can remember yourself. So how you negotiate the issue of memory within common church cultures is extremely, extremely difficult. And those are the kinds of issues I think we haven't even begun to articulate for ourselves.
Questions or comments on the topic of race, Dr. Hauerwas? Sir in the back with the ray.
You spoke earlier about Native Americans. I was wondering if you felt that it was necessary to give back more land to Native Americans in order to help ease the suffering that the U.S. government has put on them throughout the years.
I don't have any idea. I mean, one of the cruelest things we did, of course, was take the Cherokee and put them in Oklahoma. And I don't know that it'd do much good to send them back to Florida now, because Florida's California. And so I just don't. I mean, I thought one of the most positive things that happened in Native American culture was when the Navajo kicked out the anthropologists that were studying them because they didn't want to be told they had a NOMI. So how Native peoples recover the story is, I mean, they need land to do that, that's for sure. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the policy business of knowing how the best way to do that.
Lydia.
I think it's arguable that the main issue of racial inequality today is mass incarceration. Right now, 1 in 3 young black men is under the control of the criminal justice system. What should the church be doing to address mass incarceration? And where would we start talking about that?
The largest public housing project in the 90s in America were prisons. I just don't feel free to comment on that because for a white guy to think he knows what should be said about that strikes me as an invitation to stupidity, and I just think I better not say anything.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of stupidity going on there. Jordan, you had a question.
Yeah, we've talked about in Dr. Tran's class about race in America and how pursuing a sort of colorblind atmosphere isn't necessarily the best thing. But on the other hand, the other extreme of that is not wanting to essentialize people of color to their race, saying that's the most important. So how do you kind of balance that dialectic or negotiate that kind of tension where we don't want to just be colorblind and ignore race, saying that's not important, but also don't want to just obsess about race as the essential quality of even majorities or minorities?
I'm hoping that by the luck of the draw, some African American may want you as a friend, and you will know one another's names. That's the best answer I can give.
I wonder if you could say how we are under the impression that there really is such a thing, how it came to be under the impression that there really is such a thing as a white church or a black church.
Well, because there are. That just to the extent that those descriptions work, I understand the question you're saying.
Yeah.
Why couldn't we say, well, that's a Christian church, or maybe even it's Baptist, but it's trying to be Christian, or. I think, quite frankly, a lot of that has to do with the continuing history we inherited from segregation. That a church became a white church once you got integrated churches. So that's a white church. and so I just don't, I'd be silly to think I could speak authoritatively on that.
I'm going to move us on. These are questions about Christianity, congregational life in the church in America today. Dr. Hauerwas has written extensively on the central role of worship, Christian liturgy, and practices of the life of the church, the sacramental practices, the primary formation for Christians. And so these questions are related to that. The return to worship as central to Christian existence is much appreciated in many quarters. Yet worship is, of course, not an abstraction. In the Blackwell Companion, you note the unhealed divisions in the church, and it seems like many of the key divisions in the church concern traditions of worship, sacramental practices, baptism, voluntary membership, etc., etc. So my question is this: do you really think the beliefs and traditions that give rise to the particular traditions of worship can be passed over in order to find common action-based emphases in worship, or is that debate just beginning again?
Yeah. I say after teaching 25 years at Duke, I hope to have half the Methodist clergy of North Carolina feeling guilty for not serving the Eucharist every Sunday. I know that won't make the church more faithful because witness the Episcopalians. And I'm an Episcopalian, but God promised in Corinthians 11 that if we do it unworthily, God will make us sick and kill us. And I thought, well, that's more promising than dying of boredom, and at least might serve God's kingdom in some way. So I don't assume that it will not necessarily always have a positive outcome. A part of the question involves, do I think that there are faithful and less than faithful ways of celebrating the Eucharist? The answer is yes. And we need to have those debates. When I was saying in Jonathan's class earlier, when you think, well, what we're doing is just really doing Jesus a favor by remembering him, because, well, he was a nice guy and he got killed and we probably think he's still around with God, but Jesus, it's hard to really think he's really here, so we're just going to do him a favor and try real hard and remember him. What that fails to indicate, of course, is if the words are rightly spoken and the actions are rightly done, there's nothing you can do to stop God from showing up, because Jesus ain't dead, he's alive. And he shows up in the particular bread and wine of this meal in which we are made the very body of Christ. And when you do it inadequately, you drink and eat to your damnation. So you bet that's a debate we need to have. I understand, therefore, when I receive at the Church of the Holy Family, my church is called the Church of the Holy Family in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I hope it's not my church, but God's church. But I did worry when I first went there about whether it was really Episcopalian, since Holy Family is usually a Catholic name. But as soon as they called the basement the Undercroft, I knew they were Episcopalians. Let no pretension go unused. But I know Christ is present when I receive, and it may be to my damnation. And I know that Roman Catholics worry about whether Christ is present when I receive. I think they ought to worry, given our separation from them, whether Christ is present when they receive. Those are worries we need to have.
This next question is similar, but it picks up on a particular angle. Hi, Dr. Hauerwas. I spent a semester in a Christian ethics class taught primarily from the Blackwell Companion that you edited and by a professor who studied under you. Consequently, the class revolved around the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist as the overflowing abundant love of the Trinity. As the only Catholic in a class of 30 Protestants, I was surprised and confused at how the class as a whole accepted the Eucharist as the true presence, because I've always seen the issue of the Lord's Supper as a huge divider between the Catholic and the Protestant Church. How do you, as a Protestant, understand the Eucharist? Do you sneak the Eucharist at Catholic Mass on the other 3 Sundays of the month that you do not get the Lord's Supper at your church services? Does your pastor see the bread and the wine, or possibly grape juice, only as a reminder of the Lord's Supper? Can it still function in the ways the Blackwell Companion suggests as the common practice that can form moral Christians?
Well, I think I spoke to that some in the last set of comments, but we are divided by what is our most determinative act of unity. And that is a sadness that we ought to confess. And I think it has everything to do with Christians' willingness to kill one another as Christians. That we think that we can get up from the Eucharist and a Christian who is Iraqi go to one side of the church and pick up an AK-47, and a Christian who's an American go to the other side of the church and pick up a Uzi and blow one another away. Is it any wonder that the world doesn't think it has an alternative to violence? So it's not simply the unity that comes by thinking that we can share this feast, but it is the disunity that we are that makes the feast problematic, exactly to the extent that there we become the body of Christ. And when we kill one another as Christians, we don't just kill one another, we commit suicide. That's how serious this is. And we've got to confront it in a way that helps us and the world recognize that peace isn't an ideal, unity isn't an ideal, but it's a reality embodied in our very lives that we betray when, as a matter of fact, we are separated even to killing one another in the name of national loyalties.
This next question. I wanted to get your thoughts on American evangelicalism. How do you understand their growing attraction and even allegiance to you, especially since you've generally had very strong criticisms of some features of evangelicalism, pietism, contemporary worship, apologetics? I am particularly interested in your thoughts about the emergent trends like the new monasticism. On the one hand, you have had direct influence on some of the folks like the Rupta House in Durham or members of the Ecclesia Project. On the other hand, you've said you worry that such gestures reinvent the wheel. What do you mean when you describe young Protestant evangelicals, most of the folks in this room, who read Hauerwas and then move into forgotten neighborhoods, share all things in common, invigorate liturgically centered community as indications of God's sense of humor?
Well, who could have thought them up? Shane Claiborne is a part of God's imagination. That's part of, and Jonathan Wilson Hardgrove, it's God's little joke on the world. When I worry about the new monastics making Christianity up, it's that intentional communities that start off as people who were shaped by having a personal relationship with Jesus. It just turns out it's too hard to maintain a personal relationship with Jesus for a lifetime. You need the mediation of a church which has tested the waters over time. Fundamentally, it means you don't get to make Christianity up. So the very idea that there could be a new monasticism, remember it took centuries to create monasticism, is not something you do, real quick. And so I just want to make sure that that the kind of work that's being done in the new monastic is a work that is drawing on the wisdom of the church over the centuries in a way that you don't think you're making it up.
We'll turn to the question of war in a second that Dr. Hauerwas has already talked about. I wanted to see if there are any questions or comments about some of the other things that he just talked about.
Returning to the Eucharist as how it comes alive, it's by nature aesthetic, and I'm wondering how, when we go out to love and serve the world after taking the meal, how do we bring that meal to the world? And do you see any way that the aesthetics, the creative arts, play away in showing the world that it's the world?
Are you an Episcopalian?
Sort of.
Yeah, I thought, that's the prayer after Eucharist you refer. Yeah, eternal God, Heavenly Father. It's a wonderful prayer. And I oftentimes ask, I wonder, how could you pray that prayer to go in peace and think you could go kill anyone? I think, of course, that should shape our imaginations in a way that creates necessities that we would have to discover. For example, I say that I'm a pacifist, or at least committed to nonviolence, and I hate the language of pacifism and nonviolence, because pacifism is just too passive and nonviolence is not violence, so you privilege violence to say it. I hate it, but I say it as often as I can in crowds like this because I'm a Texan. I'm a violent son of a bitch, and I have no ability. I have no sense that I have the ability to live faithful to what I know is true. But by creating expectations in you, I hope you will keep me at least honest to what I have said, and that creates a necessity that forces the imagination into alternatives that otherwise wouldn't exist. And that's what I hope good art does. It's the grace of necessity that helps us see what we would not be able to see if that hadn't have been painted, if that hadn't have been sculpted, if that dance hadn't have shaped the body that way. So that's the way, if I hadn't have written it that way. So that's the way I think of those kinds of interrelations.
Professor Hauerwas, why aren't you Roman Catholic?
Yeah, I get that all the time. I think it's a church matter. If an individual certainly feels the call and the vocation to that, you will get no argument from me. But I'm waiting for Benedict to acknowledge that I am. And that's a way of suggesting it's a church matter that hopefully, if we put our heads down and try to be as faithful as we can, even as Episcopalians, we may look up and discover that we share a hell of a lot more than we thought we did, even with Baptists. And I'm deeply committed to that, but I don't think you ought to try to force it. So, by church matter, you understand, I mean, it's not just me, but it's what it means for the Episcopal Church of America to be united in itself, to be united well enough to be seen as faithful to the gospel in a way that can be claimed by Rome.
I was wondering, what are your views on other religions other than Christianity, like Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Shintoism, and whatnot?
Well, I don't have any idea what it means to be a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, or anyone else. And I think it's just sheer arrogance to think you would. I've been spending a whole life trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian. How in the hell would I know what it means to be a Hindu? So the question for me is never, do I have some answer to be given, or I have some ready-made position to say, oh, I know who you guys are, and therefore let's talk. I don't have any idea who they are, which means, as a Christian, thinking that I need to tell people about Jesus, I'll tell them about Jesus, and then they'll talk back. And I'll find out more about maybe what I believe. This becomes very, I was once giving a lecture at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. I make all the biggies. And one of the professors there was a student of John Cobb, so he was a paradigmatic Protestant liberal, and I just pissed him off down to the bone. And after I finished the lecture, I don't remember what the lecture was, but he said, Hauerwas, your problem is you give us no theory that will enable us to talk of Buddhism. And I said, well, gee, Jay, I'm so sorry. How many of them do you have here in Conway? And I mean, what good would a theory do you? If you had some, I just think you'd go over and say, what in the hell are you guys doing here in Conway? You might find out something, you know, that you shared something about Conway, I don't know. And you could, you know, so, but I just think that the idea that you've got to have some third language, or you've got to have some view that you already understand them before you start talking is crazy. That's the way, I mean, obviously we Christians, look, we Christians are filled with joy about what God has done for us, and we want to tell other people. And they get to talk back. So our job, to put it in McIntyre's language, our job is to create epistemological crises by witnessing to others, not only in them but in ourselves, and in the process we may discover that the God that has called us has never abandoned any human being.
Turn to the question of war. Given your well-known writings against war, do you think Christians can support limited military police action in order to stop genocides like those in Rwanda or Sudan?
Yes. Of course, I think that involved here, and this is very tricky, is a very strong distinction between war and police function. And I think that just war works best as police function. And in police function, you separate the attempt to separate people from violence from the judgment about their violence. So in war, Army becomes judge and prosecutor and policeman all at once. So if you could train an international police force, as police forces are trained to only use weapons in the absolute last resort, and indeed, hopefully not to have weapons at all, then yes, I should certainly want there to be such a force to intervene in places like Rwanda. What that means, that force is going to have to be constituted by people who are trained that they would rather die than kill. Now, if we can produce that kind of people and that kind of force, then I'm all for it.
How does one determine the ethical course of action in a situation where the apparently non-violent alternatives have decidedly violent actions or consequences? For instance, in deciding policy towards Burma, the U.S. has historically avoided military intervention. However, the alternatives, sanctions, and constructive engagement have contributed to an environment where within Burma, of ongoing ethno-political conflict that has resulted in death and hardship. Is violent action ever the path to less violence? If so, is violent action then ethically permissible?
No. Behind that question is the presumption that I somehow became Secretary of State. And I don't expect that to happen. And it probably won't happen because I'm just not skilled diplomatically, but also hopefully because of convictions I hold about Christ. And I mean, people get, I've used this so often, it can be tiresome, but I oftentimes say my task as a theologian is to help Christians recover the Christian we. The Lone Ranger, and everyone here are Texans, you know who the Lone Ranger was. The Lone Ranger, once and Tonto found themselves surrounded by 20,000 Sioux in the Dakotas. And the Lone Ranger looked over to Tonto and said, "This looks pretty tough, Tonto. What do you think we ought to do?" And he said, "What do you mean, we, white man?" Now, we've just become so used to asking that question as Christians as if the we is immediately available in that way of being Secretary of State. And I just don't think that we is going to be available and shouldn't be available. As a Christian, and as someone committed to nonviolence, I want to rule. Oddly enough, I'm a theocrat. It's just very hard to make people do what you want them to do when you're committed to nonviolence. But I'm willing to try. It's just persuasion all the way down. And it just, that's, but what do you do about Burma? Send missionaries. I don't know. I have no idea. I can't operate at that level.
Your Christological pacifism makes me wonder what you think of the scriptural and theological descriptions of hell. My question isn't so much about an abstract notion of hell, but about how we understand hell as pacifists.
I think of hell like I think of excommunication. Excommunication is not, we're throwing you out because you're a sinner. Excommunication is, we've discovered that you are out, and these are the conditions for your return. So excommunication is a gesture of hospitality. It may sound odd to think of hell as a gesture of God's hospitality, but I think God abandons no one, even in hell. And it is God's refusal I once was talking to an evangelical philosopher who said, don't you think hell is to experience the absolute hatred of God? I said, oh no. If God hates you, you at least know you exist. Dante had it right. Hell and the lower reaches are, you're frozen in ice, looking away from anyone else frozen in ice. It's absolute loneliness. And God refuses to leave us alone. And that's the great good news.
Time for one question about hell. Or, sorry. War. Which is hell. Yeah, there you go.
This semester I taught an honors seminar on the thought of C.S. Lewis that ended in the Screwtape Letters, which was set during World War II. One thing that was very interesting was the demons didn't seem to care much about the war. And they didn't seem to care much about whether their patient was a radical pacifist or a radical jingoist, so long as they were a radical.
Right.
And he warned of Christianity and, with the and, guides of Christianity. And I wonder, how successful do you think you've been at avoiding that pitfall, and what are your strategies for avoiding it?
There's a new, it's the Oxford or Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis that just came out. And they asked me to do an essay on C.S. Lewis on war. I rarely do that, but if you do it, you just might find it's a terrific volume. I think Lewis never thought very seriously about nonviolence as an alternative, and that because it just wasn't on the radar for him, and that he brought that kind of anti-fanaticism to the kind of account you're giving in Screwtape that came out of that war weariness that pervaded his life after World War II. He was anything but a war monk. And I guess how to avoid it, I'm not sure I do want to, because I'm a fanatic. And I want us to be unbelievably overwhelmed by God's love, making us fanatically committed not to kill.
Move to the question of Dr. Hauerwas' writing on the handicap. You have written powerfully about disability and innocent suffering. Can you say something about how churches in the believers' church or free church traditions can and should approach the sacraments, especially communion and baptism, for those with cognitive disabilities?
Well, I think we are made Christ's body for one another. And what it means for the cognitive disabled to be baptized is we see how we appear to God through them insofar as their bodies are our bodies and our bodies are their bodies. And we do for one another what God has made possible. That is, we affirm the creed for them, and they eat the body and blood for us. And we do that making possible, therefore, a community that is beyond the imagination of the world. the rationalistic presumptions oftentimes associated with what is called adult baptism make the issue of whether you baptize infants or the mentally handicapped seem problematic. But it's exactly the understanding that, as John Yoder argued, it's not that you have to know what's happening to you when you are baptized. It's that you have to be ready through baptism to have your body made vulnerable to the people of God so that we can help one another become faithful followers of Christ. So I assume that the baptism of the cognitive disabled doesn't mean that they're not open to fraternal correction, just as we are open to fraternal correction, just to the extent that our bodies are not made vulnerable to their body. That's.
Turn to the question of democracy. Jeffrey Stout's Democracy and Tradition proved a runaway academic hit, in part because it was billed as an alternative to Hauerwas. Has Stout changed your mind at all about democracy?
No.
I was wondering if you could respond to James Davidson Hunter's critique of non-political theology in To Change the World. Can the way neo-Anabaptists conceive power really change anything?
Well, I tried to be charitable about Hunter's book because at least he decided that the Anabaptists were not sectarians and that Yoder might have something to say. But the more this book has been received by the Calvinist theocrats, makes me worry more about its effect. I was once in Orange City, Iowa, speaking at Northwestern College, which is Christian Reform School. And I got up, it was right before Christmas, and it was dark and it was snowing. And I was a committed jogger, so I started jogging, and it was still dark. And I was going up and down the two main streets of Orange City, Iowa. And as the light slowly came up, I realized they had up their Christmas decorations. And the Christmas decoration, they were kind of Lake Wobegon-ish, plywood with twinkles, with Elmer's glue. And but along the main light post and across the street of Orange City, Iowa, on the light post were crosses, and in the center was the three circles of the Trinity. And the thought occurred to me that Calvinism was that form of Christianity that came out into the world to take over the world, and instead it took over Orange City, Iowa. Now, I'm for David James Hunter taking over Orange City, Iowa, and and just seeing if he can get along with his own people. So I'm not, I suppose, that thrilled with the book.
We have time for two more questions, so I apologize. We're just going to read questions from here that were submitted. This question is about what you believe about truth. Your Wittgensteinian, because we have all the time to answer that question, of course. Your Wittgensteinian linguistic approach to Christian ethics has led some to think you deny we have access to reality independent of human linguistic construction. For if all meaning is reduced to linguistic use, then all meaning is a human construct. But denying we have access to a reality independent of human linguistic construction entails affirming that our concept of God is merely a linguistic construct. Do you deny we have access to a reality independent of human linguistic construction? If so, how can we speak truthfully of God? Further, if the meaning of ethical language comes merely from its use in a community, how do you avoid moral relativism?
I hate that question. I think if anyone, a Wittgensteinian linguistic approach to Christian ethics allegedly is supposed to deny a reality independent of human linguistic construction. I'd like to see where you read that in the investigations. Wittgenstein doesn't even deny the private. What he says is there's no way to talk about it other than with language. And then if all meaning is reduced to a linguistic use, why the word reduced? Why the word reduced? And I mean, you got to remember that what Wittgenstein does is help you see that there's no dualism between language and world, because language is also world. So the idea that, I mean, what that does is impose on Wittgenstein the idealist, realist epistemological options that he, as a matter of fact, taught us not to assume if you follow carefully the way the arguments work in the investigations. And then the issue about relativism just drives me crazy. The problem is not relativism. The problem is the epistemological theories that presupposed foundationalist positions that gives you the problem of relativism. Because where are you standing when you think you can characterize the world as relative? So the philosophical presuppositions behind that question, it strike me as extraordinarily non-Wittgensteinian.
This last set of questions has to deal with the university. Dr. Hauerwas, in what ways is Christian scholarship accountable to the church? How do you see your role in the academy in relationship to the mission of the church? And the second question, my question assumes the context of two cultural trends, the trend towards technical specialization in the humanities and the trend in the wider culture towards a post-literate condition. Do you see any new opportunities or challenges for the church or church-affiliated universities regarding how to make faithful use of the liberal arts in a post-literate culture?
Well, first of all, I don't want to make too much of an ideology of the liberal arts since no one knows what they are. But I do think that the analysis about the humanities, I mean, one of the problems is the tenure structure of modern universities has meant people in disciplines have been shaped to know more and more about less and less that gives them security against the fact that they don't know much at all. And therefore, and that has the difficulty that academics only write for other academics. One of the great gifts that we've been given as Christians today is that Christian intellectuals have people who are obligated to read them. They're called Christians. And it's therefore our task to, as universities, produce a people who are a literate public. I think that one of the things that our current public discourse reveals is the absolute failure of the university to be responsible to its duty to produce literate citizens. I don't know that we're going to be able, I mean, I can't speak for universities to be able to do that qua universities, but I sure as hell can say to Baylor that they have, as a university, the obligation to produce literate Baptists. That's going to be a miracle. But it is absolutely crucial I mean, Southern Baptists have the Bible and now, and that ain't enough. And you're going to need to be reconnected to the great Catholic tradition if you're going to survive as a university, to be the kind of literate people who can produce ministers who are not idiots. And you've got a ton of them. So exactly how Baylor sees as its task to produce people through the education you receive here to know that Augustine's confessions are crucial for how we learn to live as Christians, and rejoice in that, is absolutely part of the future responsibility of Baylor University.
Last question, should the BCS move to a playoff system? I know this isn't relevant to Duke University, but increasingly to Baylor.
Do y'all play basketball here?
Some would say within a one bad call, we play basketball quite well.
I think the amount of monies that are put into football today, and you know, look, I grew up. Pleasant Grove played Mount Pleasant, and Dandy Don Meredith was their quarterback. So, I mean, you know, Friday Night Lights go all the way down with me. I understand. I mean, you know how making out rights depended on how you played on the football field? I mean, last picture show, you know, what are you doing? Well, it's my birthday. I thought we might do something special. The hell with that. You only play in the line. You don't even play in the backfield. I understand football, and I like it, but I think it's certainly threatening to over-determine the purposes of universities in a way that suggests that you're incapable of sustaining interest in reading. And if that happens, then it's a disaster indeed. And the money is just a side effect of that.
Thank you, Dr. Hauerwas.
Thank you.